So what does the Bible teach us that Mary and Joseph did as parents when that child was from age 2 to age 12? Teach them how to play video games. Let them be a part of a baseball team. Let them play soccer. Make sure they got all their P's and Q's done right. You know, it'd be interesting that between 2 and 12 years old, Mary and Joseph were very good parents. That Luke covers these boyhood years in one verse. That was just not nice of him, wasn't it? In one verse, Luke covers his childhood. That Luke records no miracles performed by Jesus during these years. That Jesus, favored by God's grace, grew. He grew physically, he grew spiritually, and he grew mentally in those very early age. By the time he was 12, he grew physically, he grew spiritually, and he grew mentally. The place where Jesus was raised in Nazareth, not a place of human wisdom would have selected for this holy development. A sinless life, there was the greatness of all miracles. Having a sinless life in the midst of a wicked place is even a miracle. So many people say we've got to get our kids out of an environment that produces this. Can I share with you, Jesus was raised in an environment that wasn't so nice. And here we are told, number one, his development in the physical strength. The child grew. And we are assuming by that if the Savior had never been a child, but always full grown like our parents, he would not have commanded so much sympathy in the world. Little children take delight in the thoughts of him who was once like them as a child. And so when children, someone had brought this up and I had never thought about it before, but children are attracted to Jesus because usually the first thing that children see about Jesus is when he was in a manger. And little small children can picture Jesus as a little baby. And so they seem to relate to him a lot better because he was born a child. And so he grew physically in those years. Number two, his development in spirit and in wisdom. It seems to refer here to energy of will and to initiative and intuitive insight, and that it would refer, it seems, to an attribute of the progress to his own effort. It seems that even though in his early years, though he was sinless, and yes, he was God, but it seems to indicate that he was allowed to grow in his understanding of what it was to be a man or a person. You know, Jesus did probably, I think Jesus set aside some of his attributes of God. I think that God set aside and allowed himself as Jesus to grow as a child. I mean, he just didn't automatically be God he was God at all times, but I'm saying in his physical form, he allowed his physical life to be all physical. He was 100% man and 100% God. But I think he allowed his 100% child to become a full-grown child, to become a child, then a young boy, and then a man. And I think he went through the whole process. And I think that is to say, he will grow in force while his soul grew in insight. And as a boy, he lacked no decision of character, and his insight was remarkable for one of his years. And it is possible that he had the God-given ability to grow in insight, and I think we also can do that too. And he became consequently object of divine grace. The favor of the Father was his by right. He won his way to it, and it could not have been justly denied him. In other words, there seems to be that in those early years, he developed, like God wanted all children to develop, that in those early years, by the training of his parents, he became the person in favor with God, and that in his early years, he began to develop a sense and a love for who he was. The human race was no longer in his Father's sight utterly depraved. A redeeming feature had appeared in the person of the child Jesus Christ of Nazareth. And God's attitude towards the world was thereby altered, and justly so. It is for us to rejoice in such a Savior as we have in Jesus, one who passed through the stages which we individually experience. All of us pass through the same stage. We grow in grace. I heard John Piper say this week that in our salvation is that we experience different levels of our grace. Now, it's true that if you're born again, as you know, when you're saved, if the Lord so directed you and you came to know Christ and you knew Christ at an early age, but we grow in that relationship. Sometimes it takes us to go to youth camp. We go to youth camp and we learn some new things about being saved, and we grow a little bit more, and then there's a period of dormancy, it seems like, and then we come to early in adulthood, and we get back under the gospel and we hear some great news, and all of a sudden we sense a greater significance to our salvation, and there's a process in our growth as being a Christian. And God, through his Son Jesus Christ, was allowed to go through all of these stages as a young boy and as an adult for a while, that he might come and he walked through the streets of Nazareth, and he saw the things that were there, and he began individually to do that. Well, after 12 years, or 10 years or so in Nazareth, and he was under the authority of his mom and dad, and he worked in the carpenter shop, as we understand, and he did those things that kids do, I suppose. And then in verse 41 through verse 50, the Jerusalem Passover was to take place, and Joseph and Mary thought it was very important for him to go to Jerusalem. And Jesus' parent went up yearly to Jerusalem to observe the feast of the Passover. And when Jesus was 12 years old, he went up with Mary and Joseph, for at that age he became a child of the law, responsible for keeping the Mosaic law, including its commands for yearly observance of the Passover in Jerusalem. Deuteronomy chapter 16 and verse 16. And one-day feast following immediately by a week-long feast of unleavened bread, Exodus chapter 23, verses 14 through 19, and Matthew chapter 26 and verse 17. And what was observed at the feast of the Passover? Well, Jesus came face to face with the ceremonies after experiencing most tender home care. It would seem, too, that Joseph and Mary had given great care to tell Jesus about the Passover. And it would seem that they took plenty of time to help them understand, why are you going to church? Now, I may practice this on Abby when she comes up Thursday, and I tell her, you know, Abby, I know she's 4 years old now?
Yeah.
She's just turned 3. And I'm going to say, Abby, let me give you some things that's going to happen when you come to church on Sunday. When you come to church on Sunday, here are some things you're supposed to expect to happen. It's going to take about 10 years for you to get this, but I'm going to keep telling you this. I think we bring our kids to church and they expect to go to the nursery. I certainly expect them to go to the nursery, and but they expect to come to church to play and have fun. I mean, all kids do that. I was at least 13 before I realized that church wasn't to have fun, But apparently, we need to help our children understand why we have church. I don't know that they get it. They might, but I think we should train them to expect how to behave. And so by the time Jesus was 12, he came in face to this idea. And while they were telling Jesus this, he must have had great insight into the deeper things that they could not even apprehend at that time. Well, their parents' care, of course, was not perfect. In the hustle and preparation for homegoing, they started with the caravan, and he went to the feast and so forth. And the 7 days of Passover feast, and it must have been a rare feast for Jesus to see, and the priest and the rituals and all the vast life which throughout the temple court. And so they were in the temple. And they looked through the temple and going through all the Passover, and it was sort of exciting. And they stayed for a while, and when time was up, through the hustle and bustle, Mary and Joseph took off to go back home. Well, in those days, they were in caravans. And in those days, sometimes families went together, and as you know, when you go to any activities, even if we have a big activity here or somewhere, kids are always somewhere else. Kids never stay with adults. I remember growing up many years ago that when we went to visit somebody, it seemed like I was always on the couch with the adults. I mean, it was in the old days that when you visit somebody, the kids didn't run off and play somewhere. When we first got there, we sat on the couch and listened to adults talk, and we behaved ourselves. You bring any you try to bring your grandkids or even our kids, and we have missioners all the time come to our house to try to get our kids to be quiet 10 minutes. We want them to go outside and play. Well, I remember one time we went visiting, and we took our kids with us so that they could entertain their kids that we were visiting. And boy, our kids could entertain other kids like you wouldn't believe. It was a madhouse. As a matter of fact, they were so noisy that we couldn't even have... It was a mess. Forget that deal. But growing up, when we went to visit somebody, we sat with our parents right there for a while. Yep. We didn't interrupt the conversation. We understood adult talk. But you know what happens today is, if you invite company over, you spend most of your time trying to get your kids to behave so you can have some conversation with adults.